Great to see everybody here today. If we've got visitors with us, as we often do, we're very encouraged by your presence. It is certainly our hope and our prayer that you will be encouraged by your time here with our congregation. And that as we study together and worship together and pray together, that you will come closer to knowing God. If you're not a Christian, then you need to become a Christian. And I hope that we can open up our Bibles with you and have a chance to study with you and show you the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is simply this, that God has done an incredible thing for all of us. He has sent His Son to die on a cross to bear the sins of the world, and that His Son has also been raised from the dead only 3 days later to give us the hope of our own resurrection in anticipation of a heavenly, eternal home with our Creator. And if you want to learn more about that, we'll open up our Bibles together with you and teach you that. But while we're talking about your Creator, our Creator, the Creator of this great universe, this beautiful, beautiful world, let's open up to Genesis chapter 1. And we won't read a lot because this is a part 2 of a lesson that I did last week. And I need to be careful not to make the introduction so long that I don't have time to get to the stuff that I didn't have time to get to last week. I just get so excited about it because I think there's a really fascinating thing that you observe in Genesis 1. In the beginning, Genesis 1 opens. God created the heavens and the earth. But it does say in verse 2 that the earth, before God gave it form and function and purpose, that God created it and it was formless and void, it says there. And that darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Now, in part 1 that I did last Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, and some of you might not have been there to hear that, I'll just give you the very, very quick version of it. In part 1, I took a look at Genesis chapter 1, and we noticed the way that God doesn't just create the raw materials of the universe, that yes, He does, and that's an astounding enough thing by itself. The fact that God creates all of the carbon and the oxygen and the sodium and all the other basic elements, and that God doesn't just form them into rocks and planets and moons and stars, but that God also gives purpose to all of the things that He creates. And I believe that that is actually what Genesis 1 is about. Now, of course, don't get me wrong here. Genesis 1 is absolutely an affirmation that God created the universe and everything in it. That is His creation. Everything that you see around you is created by God, all right? And it is sustained by God. But I think the deeper meaning behind Genesis 1 is not to say that God made the stars and then God made fish and God made birds and God made cows and then God made us. The deeper meaning behind Genesis 1 is that God made those things, and as their creator, He also has the authority to command those things. He has the right as creator over His creation to dictate not just the form of the creation, but the function of that creation. And so when He creates stars, it says later on in the chapter, He doesn't just create stars to be something to look at. He creates stars so that they would be lights in the expanse of the heavens in verse 14, to separate the day from the night, to let them be for signs and seasons and days and years. Let them be for lights in verse 15, to give light on the earth. He says, I made stars and the moon and the sun, not just as a pretty thing to look at. And I also didn't just make them to be some kind of life-sustaining thing here on earth, the way that the sun makes life on earth possible. He says, I also gave other purposes, that you can look up at them and you can help to understand the passage of time by the movement of those heavenly bodies, days and seasons and years. I gave them that they may be light, that people will have light here on planet Earth, because as he points out earlier in the chapter, light is a good thing, and light is day, and darkness is night, and light is good. He appoints for all the creatures their own ways of procreating and filling the earth and being fruitful and multiplying. And finally, He creates humanity. He creates man. and decides in verse 26 that let us make man in our image according to our likeness and let them rule. That he created man and then appointed for man a purpose. And that we don't get just to define our own purpose. I don't get to look my Creator in the face and say, well, I know that you created me, and you didn't have to, and I know that you're the only reason that I exist at all, but I don't feel like doing what you want me to do. I don't feel like being what you want me to be. I think I'm going to decide for myself, as created thing, what I want my life and my actions and my purpose to be. After all, the lump of clay doesn't get to look at the one forming it and say, you don't get to decide for me what I'm going to be. The pot doesn't say to the potter, I don't feel like being a pot anymore. God is our creator, and God created us to be something according to his will. Now that was part one. I want to talk about part two now, where we get into really the practical application, because that's all fine in theory, I suppose. And this journey through Genesis chapter 1 is all fascinating in an academic sense. But we want to know where the rubber hits the road and what it really looks like to be formed and shaped by God. Not just created by him, but created to be something. Now, maybe in your life, even as a Christian, maybe you have also felt like you're not being fully maximized. That you go through the motions, that you come on Sunday and Wednesday and you go to Bible class and you do the lesson book, and then every now and then, if you're a man, you get up here and you pass the trays around or you lead singing. But for the most part, you're wondering, is this it? I just go through my life and it's very mundane and it's very routine, and I wake up and I go to my job and I eat food and then I go to bed at night and I watch my favorite TV show, and I think that there's this sinking feeling that we all have that we're still formless and void. That God has created us, but we have not yet embraced God's will. Now, this is a great time of year, by the way, to become something more than you were last year. It's January, and I know that it's just a calendar. It's just a date on a calendar. It's a thing that we've created, right? We came up with January, February, and March and all that sort of thing. It's a way that we help to measure the passage of time, and any day is a day that is good for you becoming what God needs you to be. But maybe in January, you're trying to take advantage of the beginning of a new year and the turning of a calendar, and you say, I don't want this year to be wasted like last year. I don't want to end 2025 the way that I ended 2024 a couple weeks ago, going, I don't think I grew as a Christian. I don't think I learned as a Christian. I don't think I am stronger spiritually than the year before. I don't think I worshiped any deeper than I did before. I don't think I'm closer to my Christian brothers and sisters than I was before. I don't think I learned any new skills to be put into service for God. I don't think I taught the gospel to anybody last year. I don't want 2025 to be this formless and void lump of raw material that has not become anything yet. That's not why God created you. He didn't make you and just went, well, I guess there's Mitzi Ware. Do whatever you want. God wants us to be something, but he wants us to be something that is according to his will. There's a couple of passages, by the way, in the New Testament that I think illustrate this transformation, this change that is supposed to happen to us, that we're supposed to embrace when we become Christians. Because I can understand if an unbeliever is still feeling like the book of Ecclesiastes, like if you don't believe in God and you're still in Ecclesiastes mode going, vanity of vanities, what's the point? I don't get the point of life. Like that, I get that for an unbeliever. But if you're a believer in Jesus Christ and you've obeyed the gospel, you need to move past that. Because the New Testament presents you as a new creation. You've been redeemed by God, as it says in 1 Peter chapter 1. You have been redeemed not with perishable things like silver or gold from, what does he say here? From your futile way of life. I love that description of it. Your futile way of life. Justin Stanko told me, don't make any nerd references today because I just can't. I have such a hard time with it. But you remember the Borg from Star Trek, right? They're just out there. The nerd references, they're so accessible. But it is futile, right? And if you're living a life of fleshliness and worldliness, and it's money and it's job, and you're rooting for your football team that never seemed to win a national championship, because that's just you. And if that's all you've got, if that's all you're hoping for, that is a futile, empty, vain, wasted life. It is formless and void. But you are redeemed. You were set free from a futile way of life. And you were bought with precious blood as of a lamb unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ. Paul elaborates a little bit more on this in Ephesians 4, another great passage that challenges us that if you are a Christian, you've got to show that every other day of the week, not just for a little bit of time on a Sunday morning when everybody's looking. Ephesians 4 and verse 17 says, "So I say this and affirm in the Lord that you are no longer to walk just as the Gentiles also walk in the," there's that word again, "in the futility of their minds, being darkened in their understanding." Look, this was on purpose, and I think it's on purpose by the Holy Spirit also. How did Genesis 1 start? God created the heavens and the earth, but they were what? Formless and void. And now how is your life being described? Before you're a Christian, before God gives you purpose, before you obey the gospel and you're redeemed from a futile way of life, look at the words he uses: futility of your minds and being darkened in their understanding. You're Genesis 1. Formless, void, dark, darkened in their understanding. He says, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. Verse 19, "And they, having become callous, have given themselves up to indecent behavior for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. But you did not learn Christ in this way," in verse 20. And in verse 21, "If indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus," like this is the part that really challenges me. He's saying, if you're going to call yourself a Christian, if indeed you've learned about Jesus, if you're going to call yourself a Christian, your life actually has to look the part. You don't get just to wear the name. You don't get to talk the talk but never walk the walk. If indeed you have learned Christ, if indeed you have learned about Jesus, if indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, as truth is in Jesus, that in reference to your former manner of life, you are to rid yourselves of the old self, which is corrupted. By the way, that's what happened in Genesis 3. When sin entered the picture, this good creation that God made, what happened to it? Sin came in and the creation was corrupted. You have been corrupted because of sin in accordance with the lusts of deceit, and that you are to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and verse 24 is the kicker, and to put on the new self, which in the likeness of God, wait a minute, Genesis 1 said, "Let us make man in our likeness, in our image." You've been created in the likeness of God, which has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. I'll tell you what, the connectors between Ephesians 4 and Genesis 1 are just like slap you in the face, so obvious, aren't they? And that's what I said last week. Kind of in the earlier part of my lesson from last week, I made a comment about if you read Genesis 1 and all you're seeing is, oh, God made fish and birds. That's great, ho-hum, whatever. And if you're not seeing that Genesis 1 is actually speaking to you about your life condition, that you're formless and void and God intends for you to be created in his likeness, to have purpose and meaning, man, that you're missing the point of Genesis 1 then. So what's the application? How do I actually become the useful, formed, obedient creation that God wants me to be? How do I go from formless and void and useless to being something that is both beautiful in aesthetics and also incredibly useful and full of utility and purpose? Well, let me give you 3 applications, 3 things that you need to do to not be formless and void anymore and to make your life what it ought to be in Jesus. First, embrace God's authority. Until you're willing to embrace God's authority, you'll always be formless and void. You'll always wonder, what's the point of life? What's the meaning of all of this? I just don't feel anything. You have to embrace God's authority. Now, you learn that in Genesis chapter 1. Like that to me is one of the great foundational theological truths of the Bible. The moment that you open up the Bible, it just, boom, hits you like a lightning strike. It says, God is your creator. You see everything around you, trees, the earth, stars, everything. God created it all. He is an omnipotent being who is incredibly and unimaginably complex and powerful. And he exists outside of time and space and the material world. And as creator, by virtue of being the creator, what does that mean as far as his authority is concerned? It means that he has all authority. All authority. He is Lord of both form and function. There's too many passages up there and we have so little time to get to. Let me read a couple of these things from the book of Isaiah. Go to Isaiah 45. Real quick here in the Old Testament, Isaiah 45, and let's notice some, in just a few verses here. Go to verse 18 real quick, and then I'll go back and read something else earlier. Isaiah chapter 45 and verse 18 says, "For thus says the Lord who created the heavens, he is the God who formed the earth and made it and established it and did not create it a waste place, but formed it to be inhabited," right? He gave purpose. Not just the raw materials, but he also created and molded them to be something specific. Verses 9 and 10 of the same chapter. "Woe to the one who quarrels with his maker, an earthenware vessel among the vessels of the earth. Will the clay say to the potter, 'What are you doing?' Or the thing that you are making say, 'He has no hands.' Woe to him." That, by the way, I think that's really funny. Like the fact that there's a lump of clay that is literally being formed by a set of hands and it says, "He has no hands." Are you that dumb? Or just that unobservant about your creator? Woe to him who says to a father, "What are you begetting?" Or to a woman, "To what are you giving birth?" Psalm 95 is great also, and I wish that we had time. We could make it a whole sermon on its own, by the way, but I love the sentiment here of Psalm 95. Let me read just a selection of things from this passage that talks about our great Creator and how awesome He is. He says in verse 1, "Oh, come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout joyfully to him with psalms." It's really not that long of a psalm. I could probably just read the whole thing because it's that good. "For the Lord," it says in verse 3, "is a great God, a great King above all gods, in whose hand are the depths of the earth. The peaks of the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for it is he who made it, and his hands formed the dry land." And so, given that truth, that God's hands created everything. His hands are in the deep. His hands crafted the mountains. He's the creator of everything. What should your response be to a God like that? Well, he says in verse 6, here is how you respond to that fact. "Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker." I love the way he connects the fact that he's our creator, our maker, with our submission to his authority. "For he is our God." Because God created you, he has the right over you. And Colossians chapter 1, verses 13 through 23, that talks about Jesus also being the co-creator along with God, not only affirms the creative power of God and his Son, but also connects it with his authority and our responsibility to obey him. Now, this is manifested in several different examples. Let me give you a couple things to think about here before we move on to the next application. This means that animals, as part of God's creation, are not to be abused, and they are not to be worshiped. The book of Proverbs even points this out, where in the book of Proverbs it talks about the way that you can see in cruelty to an animal. It says in Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 10, that a righteous man has regard for the life of his beast, but the compassion of the wicked is cruel. You know, that beast, yes, it's made for a purpose, and in Genesis 1, God does dictate that we have authority over those animals, that those animals are at our disposal, that they're resources, that they can be killed and then eaten. But just because God says you have the authority over the world to eat from everything doesn't mean you have the authority to be cruel and to mistreat things. And so God does dictate, there's a purpose there and a commandment. You're not allowed to be cruel to things. But the flip side of that is, if you're not allowed to be cruel and to mistreat animals, you're also not allowed to worship them as if they are themselves God. And that's why in Deuteronomy chapter 5, he has kind of two commandments there in the 10 Commandments that address this. So first of all, you're not to make any graven images. And that includes the images of the animals. The golden calf is a perfect example of it. You're not to create graven images and worship the animals, but on the Sabbath day, you are to give your animals rest. And so there's a balance there. Time is not to be wasted. Remember in my lesson last week, one of the things that God created in Genesis 1 is the concept of time. That there's a night and there's a day, right? There's daytime. There's the passage of seasons and years. And God creates the concept of time. But Ephesians 5 says, time is not to be wasted. Time is not to be wasted. How about food? Food is a good thing, and we're to eat from the things of this world, the fruit of the earth, and the animals are there for our food. But we're not supposed to be gluttonous about those things. God has the right to dictate how we use that food. And here's a tough one. I put it separately here because it's kind of a tough one to talk about. And we won't be graphic or anything like that. But the fact is that God also created sex. And the concept of a man and woman coming together to be one flesh, there in Genesis chapter 2 in the very first marriage, is a foundational concept that finds application not just in Genesis or in Exodus, but all throughout the time that the law is in effect in the Old Testament. And then from the time the Old Testament is taken out of effect and the new covenant in Christ comes in, it still is true. And Jesus himself reaffirms the fundamental truth that a man will leave his father and mother and will cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And God, as your creator, who created your body and the body of everybody else out there and designed them to come together in the flesh, also has the right to put boundaries around human sexual behavior. He has that right as our creator to put boundaries around that. And so it is in Hebrews chapter 13 that the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For adulterers and fornicators, God will judge. Or in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, where we need to be able to possess our own bodies with honor. That we're not to give in, as he says in this passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, to lustful passion in verse 5 like the Gentiles do. That you are in verse 3 to abstain from sexual immorality. And that is a responsibility that we have before our Creator. God has that right. And if you ever want to find the true purpose in God, you have to embrace his authority over your life in every way that that authority applies and dictates. Here's a second application, though, that if you want to go from formless and void to useful and with purpose and to be an aesthetically beautiful thing in God's eyes, very good, as he says of the creation in Genesis 1, you also need to embrace God's scrutiny. The creation account shows God's spirit moving over the surface of a dark and empty earth. And God saw that it was good after each day of creation in Genesis 1. When he creates things, when he separates the expanse from the other expanse, when God brings land up and has vegetation grow, when God puts the stars, the sun, the moon in the sky, when God populates the earth with fish and birds and beasts and man himself, God says this is good. It had a moral quality to it. God dwelled in the garden and saw Adam and Eve every day without sin or shame in their nakedness and exposure. And when they ate from the tree, God came to investigate. God has a right to ask Adam and Eve, where are you right now? What have you been doing today? Did you eat from the tree? God has the right to ask those questions. Adam doesn't get to say, hey, listen, what I do in my free time is up to me. You don't have the right to come down here to the Garden of Eden and ask me what I've been eating every day. I have the right to eat what I want to eat. I have the right to do what I want to do. Stop asking probing questions, God. You're making me uncomfortable. God has the right. God had the right to go to Cain and say, hey, where's your brother right now? God has that right. God has that right. God had the right to put Job's life under scrutiny. And that's true of all the other heroes and villains that you read about in the Bible. After all, the book of Proverbs does observe that God sees everything. His eyes move over the surface of the earth to and fro, and his eyes see everything. Hebrews chapter 4 at verses 12 and 13 points out that there's nothing that escapes God's notice. And so if some aspect of your life is still formless and void, God has a right to demand an answer for that. If God's given you the talent, like this parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25, God has every right to come and get an account of that. Hey, what'd you do with that talent that I gave you? We don't get to look at our Creator who has authority over us and say, no. I do what I want with my talents. No, God's response is, no, you will do what I want with my talents. He has a right to hold you accountable and to call for an adjustment to your life. Even those who don't yet know God. Like in Acts chapter 17 when Paul is preaching to a Gentile ignorant audience in Athens, he points out that God now calls to all men everywhere to repent because we are all under one God and will be held accountable to him on the day of judgment. There's a great passage in Ezekiel chapter 20 that was pointed out to me recently. We even taught Ezekiel a couple quarters ago, and I think that this one missed my notice even back then. It's an interesting little reference that if you don't know the history behind it, maybe it would be very easy to kind of miss it. But in Ezekiel chapter 20 in the Old Testament, God makes a statement here through the prophet in verses 37 and 38. And he says here, and I shall make you pass under the rod, and I shall bring you into the bond of the covenant, and I shall purge from you rebels and those who transgress against me. I'll bring them out of the land where they sojourn, but they will not enter the land of Israel. Thus you will know that I am the Lord. And I guess I've never really known what it means that I'll make you pass under the rod. But the history behind it is that the custom among shepherds is that their rod was not just used for protection and for keeping wolves away and whatever, but as the sheep would come back in from the pasture, they would put the rod out like this horizontally, and they would use the rod as the sheep passed under it. They would use the rod to push the lamb's wool back or the sheep's wool back so that they could see the quality of the wool. So they could kind of, almost like hair, I'm going to mess up my hair here, pushing the hair back to see the quality of the skin and the wool. Are there any wounds on the animal? Are there any pests on the animal? Is there lice or fleas? Is there a skin infection? How good is the wool underneath? Is it good quality wool, or is there some problem with it? So they would make the sheep pass under the rod to inspect each sheep as it came back in from the pasture land. And God says, you're going to pass under my rod. And I have that right. I have the right to take your life and peel back the layers and go, Clay, what have you been up to lately? I have the right. God says, I have the right to make Scott pass under the rod. What have you been like as a husband lately, Scott? What are you like at work when your Christian friends aren't there to see it and hold you accountable? You're going to pass under the rod of God. You have to embrace God's scrutiny. And finally, embrace God's path. And it is often a very hard path. It's a spiritual path, not a fleshly path. It's a path that is heaven-focused and not earth-focused. And I wish we had time to look at each and every one of these passages, but in Romans chapter 6 talks about the way that we become Christians by dying and being buried with Christ in baptism and being raised anew so that we might live in that newness of life. And furthermore, because you're raised anew, now you also live a life of service to God. You used to be a slave of sin, but now you live a life of service to God. And that's a spiritual path that comes with a lot of lifestyle changes. Romans 8 elaborates on that further, that you're going to start looking at things spiritually and not in a fleshly way anymore. The flesh and the spirit set their desires against one another, and you've got a different way of life that you're now living, a different path that you're now following. Sin has corrupted God's creation. And just as God creates both form and function, so Satan corrupts form and function. Satan wrenches the beautiful, useful, well-ordered things of God back to the chaos and darkness that they were before God formed them. He convinces us that sin is our natural state when it is actually the opposite. And just because something feels like human nature doesn't mean that it is actually nature. In James chapter 3, James talks about the way that things that feel natural are often the most destructive things. He says in verse 14, "But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, don't be arrogant and lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, it's natural, and it's demonic." And where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing. Look at that disorder. It is the undoing of the order of creation, where God took formless, void things and gave them order. Satan takes God's creation and sends it back to disorder. God's path is one of discipline and self-control. Paul told Timothy that twice, in fact. He points out in 1 Timothy chapter 4 that discipline is why we do what we do, and that discipline leads to godliness. And in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7, that we have a spirit not of timidity, but a spirit of power and discipline, he says. It is a deeply spiritual and worshipful path that we live. And it is a very off-putting path to those who are still foolish and worldly. I'm reminded of Michal, one of David's wives in 2 Samuel chapter 6. She saw David returning the ark back to where it always needed to be, putting it where it belonged from the beginning. And for joy at seeing the ark finally coming where it needed to be, David takes off his kingly robes and he's in the streets dancing for joy and worshiping God. And Michal sees him perhaps from a window in the king's palace. She sneers at him. And when he comes back in, she says, "Well, that was quite the kingly behavior we saw from you. Never thought I'd see the day when a king of Israel danced around like a commoner, looking like a fool with his robes off." And David said, "I'm going to be held accountable to God. I worship God. I live for God. It is all for God. And if I'm little in your eyes, then I guess I'm little in your eyes, because I don't really care what you think. I care what God thinks. And if I worship in such a way that makes other people go, well, that's kind of ridiculous. If I make moral decisions that the rest of the world says, you would deny yourself all the fun things of this world for what? The hope of, heaven. If I come under ridicule from family and friends, from neighbors, and yes, my enemies, and they all say what a wasted life that is, I guess I'm just 1 Corinthians 15. And I say, we'll see when the resurrection happens. We'll see whose life was wasted when we're all raised from the dead, standing before the judgment seat of God. We'll see about that. But for me and for my house, we'll serve the Lord. And we'll let God give the reckoning on the day of judgment. So I'm going to embrace God's path. And it's a weird-looking path to people who are very worldly. And I suppose that's okay with me. Is that okay with you? God created this to be a beautiful, useful world. Formless and void raw material was turned into that. Sunshine, snow on the ground, a cardinal in the winter. Beautiful things like stars and trees, the animals, our own bodies that are fearfully and wonderfully made. And God has the moral prerogative over that creation as well. Are you still formless and void? That's not for lack of effort on God's part or for lack of will. The only reason that you're still formless and void is because you have not yet allowed God's will to dictate your life. You're still holding on to that selfish and self-centered way of thinking. If you're not a Christian here on this lovely day, you really ought to be. It is time to embrace God's hand as the potter in your life. So whatever spiritual need you might have, I encourage you to please come forward as we stand and sing together.
Live for Jesus, oh my brother.